record it on my computer, and then on Wednesday, we will put it up. The last thing I'm going to mention before I then introduce my dad is if people are interested, and if it works out, we'll see. I'm going to put in the chat box here a link to so that just right there. What we've been doing lately is after the large group discussion, we have popped over to a venue called Yo Tribe. What that is a setup where once you enter it, you'll get an icon for yourself. There'll be a little dot around your icon, which will follow your mouse, and you'll be able to move your avatar or icon. And then if you bump into somebody, you will open up a Zoom room. So what this does is it allows people to kind of get together, to meet up, and to chat. So historically, or when it's not a rich tradition, but say around 6:30 or 6:40, depending on the sort of the conversation and where things go, what will happen is we'll close this venue down. I did actually include it at the very bottom of your Zoom link, but if you are going to perhaps want to go to UTribe, then select that link. You want to put it in, copy it, put it in a spot where you can then re-click on it. Once we close down, we'll close down this Zoom and then invite people to that room. So with that, then what I would like to do is I'd like to now begin the process of transitioning into, we have a very special guest today. I've known him for a long time. In fact, there's a famous quip by a few developmental psychologists is that remember that you know your parents longer than you know yourself. Because you and I have been enormously fortunately to be impacted and shaped by the man who we will get to learn today. Professor of psychology, professor emeritus, professor of psychology, professor of history, a little projection and fusion and in relation, who is a long time and really renowned scholar on the founding fathers in general and George Washington in particular. He's the author of a number of books, but he died as he lived, and realistic visionary, and now more recently, First and Always. And we're really, really grateful for him to come down and share his wisdom. I got to find somebody who needs to be muted. Yes, I got him. So yes, if you can mute, or I'll track that, but that we do have then a production today in terms of a lecture rather than discussion. And so my dad will be talking about this. I want to say that we collaborated a bit on this section. In fact, we've had long-standing conversations about who was George Washington. We co-authored a blog together, and we've discussed it in many different facets. I've learned enormously about our founding father, the indispensable George Washington, and we've been able to join together and I think do some creative thought, of course, mostly spearheaded by my dad, whose knowledge of George Washington is, I would argue, second to none. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Peter Henriques and share with us who George Washington and what made him tick. Thank you.
Thanks, Gregg. And Waldemar, I see you on the screen. I just wanted to, I know we've had correspondence in the past. It's nice to see you face to face. As you can guess, it's been a rather awesome experience to watch my son grow into a mature man that develops the ToK. A lot of which I confess I don't understand completely, but there are numerous things that I've used to help me both as an historian and as a person. His justification hypothesis, the influence matrix, his discussion of the shadow self, COM-MO, those have all been very helpful to me. But today I'm going to talk more about the person that I've spent a lot of time working on, and that is George Washington. If I can get set up here to click on and share the screen. You see that okay?
We do, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me just move up here and we'll going from the beginning. My talk today is going to be on what made Washington tick. And as Gregg mentioned, my main study for the last too many years, to be honest with you, is George Washington. This is a cover of my new book, First and Always, a new portrait of George Washington. Why have I spent so much time working on a single individual? Basically, I do it for two reasons. One, I'm convinced that Washington is America's greatest leader. And secondly, I find him to be a fascinating figure who repays my efforts to understand. If you make the statement, who's the greatest leader, I would say there's three characteristics or aspects you should look at. How popular is the leader? How successful is he in achieving his goals? And what kind of character does he possess? And I think in all three areas, Washington scores very highly. Think for a moment about in terms of his popularity. Here's a man who was unanimously elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, unanimously elected President of the Constitutional Convention, unanimously elected President of the United States, even more amazingly, unanimously re-elected President of the United States, and after his presidency, unanimously appointed to be the commander-in-chief of all the forces as we looked like we were going to go to war with France. No other leader can come close to claiming that kind of popularity. But Washington was not only popular, he was consequential. There are two seminal events in the creation of our nation. One was the winning of independence, and the second was the creation of nationhood. And those two things are not the same. In both achievements, Washington is absolutely the central and crucial figure. More clearly than any other founding father, he advanced the concept of an American nation, using his immense stature to create the institutions that would bind America together. It's really a remarkable achievement. In essence, if there were no George Washington, there would have been no United States of America. Washington's not only a great man, I would argue that he's an admirable man as well. The Greeks, for whom really character was destiny, they defined character as the sum of four virtues. One was fortitude or courage. Second was temperance. A third was prudence or wisdom. And the fourth was justice. And I would argue that in all four categories, Washington comes out very strongly. Secondly, in addition to his role as a leader, I find him a fascinating figure just to study. He has repaid me for my efforts to learn more about him. One of the things I learned, this Washington is a bore to so many people, kind of a saint-like image, but he doesn't have anything to connect to many of the American people. If you kind of think of the monuments downtown in DC, think of the Lincoln Memorial or the Jefferson Memorial. These men dominate their monuments. If you go to Lafayette Square, Andrew Jackson's horse breathes fire. And then you have the Washington Monument. It's big, but it's lifeless with no touch of warming tribute to give him life. And that's, to me, the real sad aspect. I deliberately chose this close-up of Houdon's famous bust of Washington to try to give people a sense of the force of Washington's personality. I did not think of the way the art director at the University of Virginia Press did. I think she did a very good job. I was very happy the way it came out. Houdon, as most of you know, was really the Michelangelo of the 18th century. He came from France all the way to the United States to do a statue of Washington. He was willing to make the trip, as Jefferson said, because Houdon pants for glory. And he felt his own secular immortality would be connected with a statue of the most famous man of his age. He lived at Mount Vernon. I would say, I'm not sure the exact time, about a week or more, trying to study and get a sense of what Washington was like. And the bust of Washington, if you look at the picture on the screen, if you look closely, you'll see that his right eyebrow is slightly raised, his nostrils slightly flared, and his lips pursed close together. You kind of sense that he is fuming in indignation. But at the same time, he's got his temper on a leash. You notice the bust's distinctive topography is undistorted by anger. And Houdon is trying to catch this image of Washington passionate, but also in control of his passion as he goes along. Now, as I indicated at the beginning, it's no secret that I have admiration and respect for George Washington. Full disclosure, I wear a medallion of him around my neck. But despite my admiration for him, my book is no hagiography. Washington was a man, not a demigod. He had flaws. He made numerous mistakes. The amazing thing is not that he had character flaws, screwed up and made mistakes, but despite these facts, he was able to achieve such an unmatched record of success. And what I try to do, to the degree possible, and it's obviously cannot be done completely, is to understand the flesh and blood man, warts and all, and go where the evidence leads. And that's what I try to do in my last chapter of my book. It's entitled, What Made Washington Tick? And that's what I'll be briefly summarizing today. It's not an easy task. Frankly, Washington is the most fully concealed of all the founding fathers. He desperately wants to be famous, but he does not want to be known. And that makes it a more challenging situation. In the summer of 1783, Washington is waiting for the definitive Treaty of Paris to come. The war is virtually over, but not officially over. And he writes plaintively to his brother, Jack, how he is eager to get the treaty signed so that he can leave public life forever and return to what he really wants to do. As he expressed it, I have no wish which aspires beyond the humble and happy lot of living and dying a private citizen on my farm. I argue, despite such assertions, the historical evidence strongly suggests that George Washington was not a man that would be satisfied with living and dying a private citizen on his farm, even on an estate as beautiful as his beloved Mount Vernon. Now, Gregg shared some insights from Carl Jung about the shadow self, and I found this was helpful to me in understanding. Jung posits that forces in the subconscious often drive people, prompting them to erect defenses against unwanted self-knowledge. Central to understanding what happens is Jung's concept of persona and the shadow self. The persona, which is Latin for mask, is how we present ourselves and how we wish the world to see us. But in direct contrast, shadow self resides in the subconscious and is an entity that one might be defined as the sum of all personal and collective psychic elements, which, because of their incompatibility with the chosen conscious attitude, are denied expression in life. Think of your shadow self as that part of you that you hope you are not, but on some level fear you might be. After my study of Washington, I would conclude that Jung's insights help us make better sense of what motivated Washington. Basically, I believe not only does he desire secular immortality, that's fame across the ages, but his shadow self hungered for public acclaim while he could still revel in it. That George Washington ardently sought fame across the ages is a commonplace claim and has been recognized by many Washington scholars. If I have a difference, it's the amount of emphasis I put on this as an essential key to understand what makes Washington tick. Back in 1799, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in Egypt. And the Rosetta Stone was of crucial importance because it allowed scholars to finally make sense out of Greek hieroglyphics, because the Rosetta Stone had a decree in behalf of Ptolemy V, both in Greek as well as hieroglyphics and demotics as well. And that allowed people to see and translate what previously had been indecipherable. I think Washington's desire for honest fame can be something that will serve as a Rosetta Stone for us. And I also hypothesize that really Washington's persona and his shadow self are in conflict. At an unstated but deep level, he craved the ego-based gratification that came from public affirmation of the notion that he was special and essential to the creation of the nation. George Washington would certainly vehemently disagree with this analysis. He would heatedly deny that he hungered to have public adulation cascade upon him. Rather, Washington would likely be more inclined to prefer a term that's been a favorite of eulogists from 1799 until today: selfless. I maintain the frequent use of this altruistic term clouds our understanding of the flesh and blood George Washington. No doubt, he sacrificed personal happiness on the altar of country. But at the same time, he was one of the least selfless men that ever lived. A selfless man does not end up possessing over 50,000 acres of land, control over 300 slaves, and qualifying as one of the richest men in America. Indeed, the very vehemence with which he denied his desire for public adoration lends credence to the view that Washington's shadow self craved such a claim. Time and time again, he went out of his way to deny having such a failing, arguing that they had no appeal for him at all. The fervor of his denials kind of recalls Shakespeare's famous line in Hamlet to the effect that a character doth protest too much. In my book, I give a great many examples of how Washington does that. Repeatedly, he asserts he serves the public strictly out of a sense of duty to country. An excellent example of this is Washington as he was preparing to enter New York to be inaugurated president. He writes to Governor George Clinton and says, "I can assure you with the utmost sincerity that no reception can be so congenial to my feelings as a quiet entry devoid of ceremony." Of course, as George Washington knew, such a request would have been impossible to honor. This is a painting of him coming into New York. I mean, everyone just crowded. People said, "I can die in peace because I've seen Washington in the flesh." He had that kind of charismatic appeal. And indeed, if my analysis has any merit, an unheralded appearance would have in fact deeply disappointed him. The example demonstrates a key aspect of Washington's public persona, that he acts out of a profound sense of duty, characterized by disinterested service to the greater good. However, an analysis of his actions considered over his lifetime demonstrate that Washington was not a selfless man who simply engaged in disinterested service. Pattern emerges of a man who was deeply ambitious, massively concerned with his reputation, and in regular search of approbation of an adoring public, even as he denied such records. Indeed, if we think of the shadow self as that portion of our psyche that fears one might be but hopes one is not, we can readily interpret Washington's repeated assertions as his attempts to justify himself and to others that he did not really seek power and influence for any internal gratification. Exactly where Washington's drive came from, it's impossible to know, but obviously he was very strong on extroversion, outgoing, focused on approaching goals, an emphasis on acquisition, a willingness to take risks to achieve what he wanted. Now, when Washington was a young man, his goal was to rise to maximum prominence in Virginia society. The Virginia society of the 18th century was a patriarchal, hierarchical, deferential, and completely dominated by the members of a gentry that set itself apart from the rest of the people, the common folk, by their number of slaves, their manner of dress, their sumptuous lifestyles, and their litters. Now, Washington wanted this, but he faced real hurdles. His family was only second-tier status gentry, and that became very shaky when in 1743 his father suddenly died. Washington was only 11 years old. Beside the significant financial loss, Washington, who was the eldest of 5 children, would be raised by a strong-willed, controlling, and emotionally demanding single mother who was intent on having her firstborn and favorite child focus on meeting her needs rather than achieving his goals. Of course, some factors went Washington's way. He was fortunate that his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who was now the master of Mount Vernon, married into the very powerful Fairfax family, living a few miles downstream at Belvoir. And Belvoir's master, William Fairfax, who gets less attention than he deserves, he was a member of the governor's council, the most powerful man in Northern Virginia, and he became young Washington's mentor and champion. A key event. Without his help, Washington probably would not have been able to have the opportunities to rise as he did in the French and Indian War. Now, given my thesis that Washington had conflicting feelings about his own drives, it's worth noting that his hunger for worldly success conflicted with his upbringing, especially his mother's values. More steeped in faith than her son, the widowed Mary Ball, Washington held that honor, fame, and wealth paled as rewards in comparison with eternal happiness. Stacked against God's glory, her theology saw the honors of the earth as just so much rust. Put it another way, they were poor, empty, insipid things in the final counting. But despite such an upbringing, the evidence to me indicates that George Washington cared more about the immortality of his legacy than he did about the immortality of his soul. Although investing little attention to his own heavenly personal life after death, George Washington was deeply invested in ensuring the continuation of his earthly legacy. His view, which never changed, appeared in an early letter that he wrote to the bewitching Sally Cary Fairfax in 1758, commenting on the death of a young British officer. Washington said this: "Who is there that does not rather envy than regret a death that gives birth to honor and glorious memory?" In a revealing personal letter to his friend and confidant, Marquis de Lafayette, Washington explains one way of achieving glorious memory. It's a fascinating letter. It says in part, he's introducing Joel Barlow, an American poet. He's considered by those who are good judges to be a genius of the first magnitude, to be one of those bards who hold the keys of the gate by which patriots, sages, and heroes are admitted to immortality. Such are your ancient bards who are both the priests and doorkeepers of fame, of the Temple of Fame. In some instances, by acting reciprocally, Heroes have made poets, and poets have made heroes. Its reference to heroes making poets and poets making heroes is especially pertinent when it comes to looking at Washington's attitude towards becoming the subject of a biography, something I've not seen discussed in any other books on Washington. His public attitude was very clear. Any memoirs of my life, distinct and unconnected with the general history of the war, would rather hurt my feelings than tickle my pride while I live. I'd rather glide gently down the stream of life, leaving it to posterity to think and say what they please of me, than by an act of mine to have vanity or ostentation imputed to me. Vanity is not a part of my character, he said. This declaration, however, contrasts with Washington's intense efforts to enlist David Humphreys, who was a former aide of his, to write a biography. Humphreys, who knew Washington extremely well, some of you, I'll show this picture, the larger picture later. The man next to Washington is David Humphreys when he returns his military commission after the end of the war. Very close to him. This is Humphreys later on. Washington invites Humphreys to Mount Vernon. Not only does he invite him to Mount Vernon, in addition to that, he says he would be treated as one of the family. He would have complete access to Washington's vast trove of papers, full access to ask Washington anything that he wanted about various issues. And Washington explains why he wants it. I should be pleased indeed to see you undertake this business. Your abilities as a writer, your discernment respecting the principles which led to the decision by arms, your personal knowledge of many facts as they occurred in the progress of the war, your disposition to justice, candor, and impartiality, and your diligence in investigating truth, combining fit you when joined with the figure of life, because Humphrey's a young man, for this task. Now, the general certainly knew that Humphreys would not be impartial in the way we use the term impartial. Washington hoped a poet would help make a hero. And Humphreys was a poet whose admiration and affection for his commander was, like Lafayette's, boundless. Consider this poem he wrote in 1782, describing the general. The foe then trembled at his well-known name, and raptured thousands to his standard came. His martial skill our rising armies formed, his patriotic zeal their generous bosoms warmed, his voice inspired, his godlike presence led. The Briton saw, and from his presence fled. That godlike presence, that's the way Humphreys saw Washington. Who better to chronicle the life of someone desiring fame across the ages than one who considered his godlike presence? Humphreys did live at Mount Vernon for a few years, wrote a partial biography that was never completed. Washington read over it, talked about it, made some comments. It's as close as we have to a partial autobiography. And in one comment, indicative of how he wanted to be remembered, it's kind of interesting where he writes to Humphreys, by the way, told Humphreys to destroy these notes. Humphreys did not do it. Whether it be necessary to mention that my time and services were given to the public without compensation, that every direct and indirect attempt afterwards to reward them was refused, you can best judge. I think we can understand that Washington, can there be any doubt that he expected Humphreys to include and invoke that sacrifice? Further evidence of Washington's desire for secular immortality is in his extraordinary concern with preserving his papers, private and public. By the way, the University of Virginia, in conjunction with Mount Vernon, is doing these papers. When they're completed and they're made great progress, it will be approximately 90 volumes of papers, all of over 700 pages or more. 90 volumes. It's an amazing amount amount of material. From early on, the record of his existence fascinated Washington. And he reveals, perhaps most clearly, if indirectly, the sense he came to have that the importance his life held for history for posterity, and I add his fame, in his attitude toward his papers, which he'd gone to extraordinary lengths to gather and protect. He actually planned to build a new building just to hold the first presidential library if it had actually come to pass, which of course it did. Another way was his willingness to sit for portraits. He might mildly complain, but he was allowed to have an amazing number of portraits done, all, of course, helping his memory live on after his death. He allowed Houdon, when he came to Mount Vernon, to make a life mask of him, a very unpleasant experience of jamming all this clay-like substance around his face, had to breathe through a straw for a number of hours to make this. Final example of Washington to promote his secular immortality is the very high likelihood that while he kept it from public knowledge, he apparently decided to have his tomb located in the very heart of the United States Capitol. This is, I believe, is accurate. It is a debate among Washington scholars. As Washington recognized, he was a great champion of building a powerful city on the banks of the Potomac, following European models. If you don't have a force to unite the country together, it will break apart. And he saw his own self as a symbolizing factor along that way. William Thornton, who was the designer after L'Enfant was fired of the Capitol, he talked to Washington, almost certainly did this with his approval. Thornton drew up plans for a structure, a central rotunda, and at the Capitol's exact center was an equestrian statue of Washington, and underneath the equestrian statue would be Washington's final remains, where he would be as a symbol to pull for the country. Of course, it doesn't happen. There's complicated reasons why it didn't. But it's interesting to me that right after Washington's death, John Adams proposes this. He writes his Washington's wife, Martha, and she immediately agrees, as long as she can be buried with him, that he will be buried in the Capitol. Now, the reason I think this is interesting for the point I'm trying to make is contrast this with Washington's written directions of what should happen when he dies. It is my expressed desire that my corpse be interred in a private manner without parade or without any funeral orations. There's a contradiction in these statements that highlights the tension in our effort to understand what forces drove Washington. I think his persona and his shadow self are in conflict. Now, much evidence from the historical record leads to demonstrate Washington once, this is a somewhat romanticized, Charles Wilson Peale porthole painting. Washington strove to be special, works to have others see him that way from youth until the day he died. Although he asserted that vanity was not a part of his character, there can be little doubt that Washington took enormous pride in his appearance. He was blessed with a remarkable physicality. 6'2", 6'5" in modern terms, a superb athlete, a natural athleticism that he worked hard to maintain and to enhance. He took fencing lessons, not because he expected to run a foe through, but rather to improve his graceful movements. He became a marvelous dancer, and more significantly, the best horseman of his age, both skills that were highly admired and drew favorable notice from onlookers. And of course, he got to dress to the nines for it. Attention on Washington's apparel, I think, is worth looking at a little bit. In his world, appearances matter. He wanted both to fit in and to be noticed. And he early developed and displayed a detailed personal style He dressed strategically, whatever the part. It might be junior officer on the make, it might be fox hunting planter, senior military commander, president. The attention he pays to his military uniforms is, I think, particularly telling, especially as it pertains to his desire to be viewed as exceptional. An invoice on the French and Indian War, and by the way, Washington becomes the commander of the Virginia forces at the age of 23. You don't think he's a person. He devoted more than a third of his salary as an adjutant for Southern Virginia on a new dress uniform from England. The rich crimson coat, glorious with gold braid and 48 gold gilt buttons. And the same invoice includes 2 handsome livery suits for his servants, emblazoned with his coat of arms. Obviously, Washington expected to ride about in high style. As most of you know, he wore his brand new uniform to the Continental Congress when they were in the process of choosing a commander-in-chief. And after he was chosen commander-in-chief, he had a Philadelphia tailor, better skilled than the one at Mount Vernon, make him yet another brand new uniform. And he ordered a blue ribbon, quote, to distinguish myself. He did not mothball his uniform with the conclusion of the war in 1783. Significantly, when he decided to attend the Constitutional Convention in the spring of 1787, he brought his uniform with him, donning it once again to ride triumphantly into Philadelphia, escorted by the city's militia to the czars of the crowd. There are pictures. This one actually is in New York. As president, he traveled to each of all 13 states in order to rally people around the United States of America. And as before each town, he would put on his vintage uniform, mount a beautiful large white stallion by the name of Prescott. Prescott's hooves were painted and polished before each appearance, and it left onlookers with a memory that they would remember to their dying day of seeing their hero in the flesh and in glory. This love of uniform lasted to his death. After his presidency, when he's called back to command the forces in the near war with France, he spends a remarkable amount of time on what kind of uniform he will wear. And I don't have time to go into the details, but he wanted beautifully embroidered. And he writes to his tailor, engage whichever embroider is the most celebrated and esteemed the best. Now, obviously, Washington's deft use of wardrobe to communicate power and cement loyalty seemed to have served him well. But of course, his countrymen' admiration and affection for him derived from much more than fabric and gilt. Americans loved him for how he conducted himself, especially in the aftermath of his appointment as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. That thrust him into the spotlight. He never left it until he died 24 years later. The American cause needs heroes. And obviously, the first place they looked to Washington, and he fulfilled their need. John Adams put the appeal that Washington had, both then and now, a gentleman of one of the first fortunes on the continent, leaving his delicious retirement, his family and friends, sacrificing his ease, hazarding all in the cause of his country. That's no doubt how the mature Washington wished people to see him, and indeed how the vast majority of Americans did see him. I think once he becomes commander-in-chief, he really believes that Providence, as he usually calls, God had chosen him for an epic role, to embody the noblest Roman attributes, disinterested virtue, and to do so in a just cause, which would expand Republican government and human freedom. And for the remainder of his life, he fashioned and wore a public mask of extraordinary revolutionary virtue. That's not an easy job. And Washington is always worried, can he carry it off? Obviously, his elevation to the top rank is full of great possibilities, but also great risk, especially for a man. If you want to understand the tension in Washington, Washington has a desire for success combined with a fear of failure. That's really him in a thumbnail sketch. He's always worried that he will not be able. He's always apologizing for not doing the job well enough, saying he's not able to do it. His fear of failing and the wreckage of his reputation fired him in almost unquenchable desire for approval, as well as extraordinary sensitivity to criticism or anything like it. Enemy bullets never aroused in him the fear that he harbored of criticism. Ultimate victory in the war after 8 long, brutal years. And virtually every critic was silenced by that. In December of 1783, the capital was temporarily at Annapolis. You can still go and stand at the spot where Washington gave back his commission. This act, followed by his return to civilian life, cast him as the American Cincinnatus. He was a man who had left his agrarian idol to fight for and obtain his country's liberty, and then, mission accomplished, ceded power and went back to resume his life at his beloved farm. That is what Washington consciously played and believed Providence had given him. There's all sorts of theatrical references in Washington's correspondence. It indicates that he saw the world as a stage, and it's not wrong to think of him on stage fulfilling a role, as long as you don't see him just as an actor. The Greek word for actor is hypocrite, and Washington's not a hypocrite. He is playing a role that he absolutely believes in, this embodiment of revolutionary virtue. You know, in the influence matrix, Gregg talked about people have desire for 3 main things: power, love, and freedom. Washington would certainly score very high in his desire for all 3. And there's no doubt that a genuine part of him desired freedom and autonomy that came with being the master of Mount Vernon. And had Washington simply desired autonomy, being Mount Vernon's master would have sufficed. But he held in his head and in his heart irreconcilable ambitions. As much as he prized autonomy, freedom from the influence of others, he prized power, that is, influence exerted through dominance, and love, influence granted through affiliation, even more. That's why, while part of him desires to be at Mount Vernon, he often feels compelled to leave it. He's drawn. You remember the words of the wonderful musical Kid Hamilton. He wants to be in the room where it happens. And he was drawn even more powerfully by the need for love. Not romantic affection, of course, but love and admiration of right-minded men and women everywhere. Put yourself at the center of power and influence, trying to win and keep the affection and admiration of his compatriots required an enormous investment of time and energy, much of it on things he would rather not have done. Something had to give, and ultimately it was his personal autonomy. Like Faust, forced to pay the price of his ambition, George Washington discovered that fame and veneration pursued over a lifetime could only be had at enormous cost. I think Washington would have asserted that the price of cost of public service was worth the enormous sacrifices that he made. He believed, as he wrote to Lafayette, the way a leader of a country could immortalize his name, in quotes, was by enhancing the prosperity and happiness of his people. In other words, the success of the American experiment would give Washington the secular immortality that he saw. Washington's self-love and love of country coincided. Indeed, I think they were inseparable. Regardless of the forces of his shadow self, he's a remarkable man. And his sacrifices, a gift to mankind in general, and his beloved country in particular. Among the founding fathers of the great unfinished symphony that is America, George Washington holds a place unique and immortal, first and always. He fathered no children, but in a symbolic sense, the United States of America was his offspring. Without him, the experiment in Republican government would never have had a chance to thrive. I think we owe him a great debt. I'll be happy now to throw it open to Gregg or however you handle the question and answer period. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful, thank you. If you want, you can stop sharing the screen. We'll bring the audience back in. And it's at the top of your system there. So yeah, we'll open this up to questions. Let me try to keep yourself muted because there are a lot of people here. So, but let me say thank you, Dad. That was a very, stirring as is my father's history. It's a very, very engaging lecture. So thank you so much for that. And then, so let me go ahead and open it up and see who has questions. I think we'll start with Rob. If you first unmute yourself, then Dad, if you unmute yourself, I was getting a little feedback, so I muted you. But go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so first off, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I wasn't expecting a dive into shadow quite like that. I really enjoyed that. I think it's really, really interesting. And if you explicitly answered this in the presentation and I somehow missed it, I apologize. But I'm fascinated with kind of, what a great man he was, and you knowing him certainly better than anyone I know, could speak to who he was as a person. What would you say are 1 to 3 to 5, like sort of character parts of him that really made him stand out as a leader and an effective person? I mean, was it intellect? Was it charm? Was it determination? Those types of things. What stands out to you as exceptional about him as a person?
Rob, that's a perfect question from my perspective, because the first chapter of my book is on what made Washington a great leader. I summarize it and go into, there are 10 things that I picked. First and foremost, he was unbelievably lucky. No one gets to the very top unless the cards just fall the right way. His physicality was a tremendous advantage. But in terms of more of his traits, he was, as I indicated, extremely ambitious. He was a man of great passion. I think that's the thing that people miss the most, because he has a stoical control over his passion. So he doesn't look passionate, but it's controlled passion, not lack of passion. He also has, I think, a wise understanding of the way the world works. I call my book Realistic Visionary. He has a fairly dark view of human nature. Men are selfish. They're driven by self-interest. And if you don't set up a system that plays into that, you don't set up a system that will work in the real world. He's a man of tremendous talents. Doesn't have the mind of a Hamilton or a Jefferson or a Franklin. Okay. He's highly, highly intelligent. And there's a difference between wisdom and brilliance. He's a very wise man. His judgment, he's able to find people like Hamilton and Madison and generals, young generals like Knox and Nathaniel Greene. He's a tremendous ability to recognize talent, and he understands power. He understands how to get people to do what he wants them to do, and that's a tremendous advantage. And I do think he combines this with an admirable character, as I mentioned, those 4 highlights of his courage, his prudence, and his wisdom, and his justice.
Two quick follow-ups really fast. One, like honesty, was that something that was like maybe candidness or something? Like, is that him? And also the 6'2" to 6'5", did the measurements change since then? And I didn't get that memo, or
no,
what did you mean by that?
Enough.
Those are my last 2.
Washington lies. There's no question. I can give you examples. He's not, but he is a man of remarkable integrity. And he expects, like the people he deals with, he's very sensitive about business. He's a businessman. He's concerned with making money and being dealt. He'll pay fairly, but the amount of grain he gets from you or whatnot better be the right amount. So he's certainly a man of a man of absolute integrity within the frame. He was able to say near the end of his life, I don't believe I've ever given my word and not followed through on it. That's quite a statement. The second part, what was the second part you mentioned?
So I might have misheard you, but I thought you mentioned he was a big man,
6'2".
6'2", but 6'5".
What I meant, there is some debate on Washington's height. Best guess is 6'2". That's what the Houdon statue that he measured him from light is, and that statue is in the center of the Capitol building in Richmond. It's one of the great works about. The bust is out Mount Vernon itself. The statue is in the Capitol at Richmond. I said 6'5" because the average soldier was 5'7" at the time of the American Revolution. What I meant is he would have the same impact as you standing around someone 6'5" today. Not that he is 6'5", but in terms of his comparison, John Adams, who was my size, hated it. Washington got picked because he's a head taller, like the Jews picked their king because he was a head taller than anybody else. Adams got pretty annoyed that Washington had this physicality, but it's a tremendous advantage. Washington would, and it's one way kind of say it, he would not have been the great leader he was if he didn't have this remarkable physical persona. Tremendously strong, graceful. He looked the hero's role. Luckily, it wasn't just a facade. There were things behind it that he was able to, wasn't just an outward.
Great. Other questions? Lee?
Thanks for a great talk. 3 years ago, I went into New York and I saw a musical named Hamilton. And in that, Washington's wardrobe was very good, but it didn't compare to King George's outfits, okay? And if you think about it, the head of state that you would compare Washington to before democracy was a thing would be a king, not his current role. So is it possible, or what might be the chances, or what's your assessment, that he was trying to dress less than King George rather than more than his?
It's an excellent question. Washington tries to find a tight little, the eye of the needle. Look, we're establishing a republic. We're rejecting monarchy. There's great fear, especially among a group of the public. Eventually, the Jeffersonian Republicans were going to slip back into monarchy. Monarchy is something you don't want. On the other hand, Washington feels you have to have a certain amount of grandeur and splendor and respect. Or, Jimmy Carter carrying his briefcase may look good, but that's not going to be the kind of thing they want. And Washington does go around sometimes in a carriage with white horses. He also often deliberately goes for a walk around New York City into the mud so people see him. I'm not a king. He's very sensitive on that score. He is the leader of a free people in a republic. He's not a king, but he did believe that if you move in the direction without certain authority, without certain splendor, you will not be able to lead. I mean, he felt that way, and there's a certain aloofness. Washington's not the kind of guy you'd sit around with and have a beer and slap him on the shoulder and that kind of thing. There's an aloofness that he feels is necessary to be the kind of leader in the time frame in which he lived, which is the movement for Republican. We're moving towards a democracy. I mean, the basic difference, a republic comes from the power from the people, but it's ruled. They pick the leaders and the leaders rule. Democracy is much more that the leaders do what the people want, rather than a republic where the people pick the leaders lead, and if the people don't like them, then they replace somebody else. Washington didn't really see the advantages. I think it's one of his weaknesses. He didn't see the advantage of the loyal opposition, political parties. He was always opposed. He saw them more dangerous than beneficial from his own fairly conservative Republican view of how things.
Great. Great. Joe Mikulski's got a question, and then Waldemar. Joe, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Joe. Yes.
Yep.
My apologies, actually my screen froze, a little unstable here.
Okay.
I
will try to imagine how you look. Fire away.
Okay, thanks. On I guess a different issue, and it strays from your talk. I hope you don't mind, but I've always been fascinated by the tensions and the contradictions that certainly many of the founding fathers must have experienced with respect to the issue of slavery. I'm wondering, and I studied Jefferson a bit because I went to the University of Virginia. And,
I did too. That's where I got my doctorate.
There you go. Gregg only, he made it to James Madison, but anyway.
I did not get into UVA because I lacked necessary.
I actually didn't know that. Okay. Anyway, but I've never, and then actually last time I was there at Monticello, I bought one of his biographies. But I tried to find out what I could about his views on slavery, and it was very slim pickings, and how they were able to reconcile both, the rhetoric and the literal, policies that emerged with this and with this view of human nature and the human condition. Can you comment at all on his views on slavery? Let me just end it there without getting.
Sure. Excuse me one minute. The question, I have a chapter in my book, Lives of Their Own, where I examine 6 or 8 of Washington's enslaved workers. He's such a record keeper, you can actually make them come alive, and you can see some of the horrors of slavery in them. There's no question that slavery is the darkest chapter in Washington's story. It's the darkest chapter in America's story. From the very beginning, the corrosive chain of racism and slavery snakes through the Republic. It diminishes the life of everyone it touches, diminished Washington's life. And I can see people of color in particular having not been able to quite have the same kind of admiration for Washington that others might because of this terrible blot. But you have to judge, to me, you've got to figure it in the time in which he lived. I mean, Washington is born into a society, 40% of Virginians are enslaved for life. His parents are firm believers in slavery and have slaves. His Bible teaches him slavery. His church teaches slavery. His society teaches slavery. The system is run that way. How can you expect a young person born into that system at first to do anything other than accept that's the way life is? Washington does become increasingly sensitive and becomes increasingly anti-slavery with the passage of time. He's the only founding father to free a slave. And he speaks out strongly, personally, against slavery. Now, he's got a dilemma, and you may criticize him for it. Washington believes the most important thing for him is to strengthen the Union and keep it together. An attack on slavery in the 1790s would destroy the Union. Wouldn't free the slaves, it would destroy the Union. His priority, really, which is very similar to Lincoln's later on, the key thing is to save the Union. So he does not like if there's a move to brought forth by the Quakers to abolish slavery. Not that he's not personally sympathetic to it, but it will be damaging to his overall goal. And I'm a little concerned when I see book on the news and I see Washington statues pulled down, people calling him a racist and so on and so forth. We do live in an age. I think Philip Roth made to me an excellent quote in the Human Stage. He said, people love the ecstasy of sanctimony. They love to feel morally superior. And it makes them feel good. Well, Washington's a racist, Jefferson is a racist, or so on. And you can do that with virtually anybody who comes before us. No one would be pure enough. I mean, Lincoln is opposed to intermarriage. You know, FDR deals with Southern senators and so on and so forth. I think we've got to be on guard against that. Within the confines of where he lived, he moves in the right direction, definitely. As far as I wish he had gone, no. But you have to judge a man within the time frame. And you don't celebrate that part of his life, but we should commemorate his life and his contributions. The idea that somehow is they're proposing, and maybe we should take away the Jefferson Memorial and the Washington Monument, just shows, to me, a very sad understanding of the human condition and what they've done for the country.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that.
All right. Then Waldemar.
Peter, that was can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am particularly interested in this idea about the shadow self. We have this romantic view of Washington, of course. But when I look at Washington and the other fathers of the nation, in some ways they are not so different than the politicians of today. They have big egos. There is a sense of narcissism that is exuded by them in various means. And yet, Washington, as you demonstrated, had this firm grip on limits. Some sort of boundary was understood. And for the most part, I think on the other great leaders of our nation, the development of our nation, they had that same sort of limitation beyond which they would not step. And I'm curious if you would comment upon what you see from your studies. What is it that Washington and these other men had in their, perhaps in their genes, perhaps in their development, perhaps in all both, that led them to have characters that are so different than some of the characters in today's public life and in today's politics?
That's a good question, not an easy one to answer, but I would say myself, the real key is, at its best, these men are deeply honor bound. Honor, to be honorable, to die with honor. I mean, the idea of, you know, when Major Andre is taken out in the Benedict Arnold thing, and Washington says, of course he died like a man, a gentleman. If Washington had been captured, his own sense of personal integrity and honor, he would not sully that. He once said, he admitted he had certain drives, but he said, avoiding left-handed attempts at popularity. In other words, I will not, during the near war, when the French Revolution blew up and England and France went to war in the 1790s, and we were torn, we almost went to war with England because they were violating our rights. And Washington sent John Jay over to England to negotiate a treaty. The treaty was a lousy treaty, but it avoided war with England, and Washington signed it. And he got by far the most criticism as a sellout, as he's giving in to England. We're becoming basically a servant. His view was, you have to do what is in the best interest of the country as you understand it and see it, and if the people reject it, they reject it. But Washington does have a very strong sense of honor, and I think, you know, to be honest with you, one of the scary things, these people, there's no way, I'm sure there are people like Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Franklin out in the world, they're not going to come to the top of this kind of system. The system just does not allow for those kind of people to emerge. They wouldn't do it. So it's, and I should qualify. I mean, there are men of integrity, and politics is an honorable field, and there are people of honor and integrity. But the system is really set up, and it's very difficult, unless you make significant compromises, move up in the world. Washington's at the very lucky, the time, this is the great time to be alive if you're people like Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton. Aristocracy's dying, but democracy's not yet here. The idea of superior people is acceptable in a way that it's not acceptable later on. I want Jimmy Carter, I want to be as good as the American people. There's no way that George Washington would ever think in those there is a natural elitism, and Washington is an elitist. I mean, he would not fit in well in terms of a 2020 democratic system. That doesn't mean he has this sense, and I think maybe one last point on your comment. I like to think, and why I love Lincoln so much, American in my humble opinion, he has this sense we're all dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Sure, Lincoln is a superior person, as many of you are in one way superior people in terms of your mental abilities and all. But ultimately, down to earth, it's dust to dust. There isn't a inherent superiority that I can crush you because I'm better than you. That's makes them more admirable figures, I think.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? I have one question. Dad, can you talk a little bit, this came up quite a bit in our discussion, and this is relevant, I think, for the theory of knowledge, just about the relationship between being a historian and being a psychologist, and just reflect a little bit about, we had shared some exchange, had some chapters that then got evaluated by others. Can you just talk a little bit about, psychologist to historian, as the professional boundaries and the interrelationships between those domains, and what it was like for you as a historian to sort of enter into some psychological waters and other people's reactions?
Yeah. There are a lot of, I'm nervous about what I call psychohistory, and some people call psychobabble. I just checked a review on Amazon, which liked the book, many interesting chapters, except the last chapter where he went into psychobabble. That's what I just gave you. That's the way some people would view that. So I know when Gregg and I had a chapter in the initial book, Realistic Visionary, a number of the historians said, well, the book's good, that chapter's got to go. It moves into an area where historians feel a little nervous. My own feeling, obviously, I see it that I'm nervous about it. I put forth this idea of the shadow self with Washington tentatively. It makes sense to me. I've not seen it anywhere else in terms of a way to understand what makes him move. I think one of the things I worry about a little bit with this is that people will come out hearing the talk and say, Washington's just a hypocrite. He really just out there grabbing for himself, doesn't give a damn about everybody else, just pretends. You have to remember, this is the pre-Freudian age. He has no idea. He's in no way is he consciously saying, I want this and I'm going to trick them by saying this when I'm really getting that. He'd take a lie detector test, he'd absolutely be fine. He does not, he might, like, if the truth of the shadow self is true, he might feel some of these things. And it was interesting, after my next project is Washington's relations with John Adams. So I started to read John Adams' correspondence, and I came across, interestingly, a quote. John Adams, without the shadow self analogy, says Washington might think these things, he doesn't know his own heart. He loves glory and adulation. I'm saying, yes, that's exactly, I'm making that point. He wasn't able, but it's not hypocritical to do this. I think that's an important point.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And indeed, from my vantage point, one of the great frustrations I have with my field is that it's so unbelievably ambiguous and so unbelievably fractured and has so many different languages and frames of reference that it can very easily turn into psychobabble, right? So if you then utilize the shadow self, now you're going to bring in, well, how close are you to Freud and the relationship to Jung and Jung's version of reality and all of that? Of course, my frame of reference is actually, if we back up and get the right level of specificity, the idea that you have subconscious motives in relationship that you filter out as you try to justify to yourself and to the public what it is that you're trying to do, and you experience dynamic tension. Anybody that would say that that's psychobabble needs to look in the mirror and realize that they're a person and a primate simultaneously, and the nature of the condition is to dynamically wrestle with those, and to rationalize otherwise is diagnostic. So for me, the frustrating is, I'll just echo that in terms of the structure, is the unbelievable chaos of our field makes, I think there are a lot of silos issues in the academy itself, and I think psychology with its unbelievable chaos makes it such that we cannot transpose what we have to offer with other disciplines. I also think other disciplines are a little defensive about it. So it was an interesting exchange between us as psychologists and historian, but I deeply appreciated it. I think that you have unearthed, in my estimation, and this is certainly why I support it so clearly, an enormously clear picture of somebody who has sublimated their desire for disinterested service and have fused their interest with the country in a way that has a particular level of integrity, yet to do so, they have to take their selfish drives and then regulate them somehow. And you have shown through his correspondence and through his behavior and through that inconsistency, the obvious tension, which is basically, for as far as I'm concerned, sort of the nature of being human. And to elucidate it with George Washington, who I hope people realize has been such an elusive figure to get a clear picture on. This is why to make George Washington tick is a very novel thing in history, because he has been opaque to deconstruction. And I think you've done an absolutely brilliant job in delineating a key aspect that has heretofore not been clearly given the right voice. So I appreciate
Thanks for that.
So, all right. Well, that concludes then this particular section. It did take us to 6:44. For anybody that wants, what I'm going to do then is I'll wrap up the Zoom here. Dad, thank you so much for your time. I think it was a really enjoyable thing, but I'm really glad we got it recorded. I think other people will share in that, so thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead, and then there's the Yo Tribe link. So if anybody wants to just cut and paste that, I'm going to close this meeting out, and then I'm going to go hang out in that. You will have to have your Zoom closed down, and then we can go veg there for 15, 20 minutes or whatever till 7:15 for anybody that wants to do that. If I don't see you over there, everybody, concludes our ToK gathering. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Everybody,
Thanks for
take
the
care.
attention, guys.
Amen. Thank you. Appreciate it.